Welcome back, everyone. We may be joined by others as the afternoon goes on, but I want to welcome you back. And we're going to shift to our afternoon segment of our conference. We changed our format a little bit to more of a conversational format. So I'm going to introduce our next two panelists. Directly to my right is Dr. Terry Price. He's a professor of leadership studies at the Jepson School of Leadership, and he focuses on leadership ethics and moral psychology. He also studied politics for 2 years as a John M. Olin Fellowship at Oxford. His book, Leadership Ethics: An Introduction, focuses on everyday leadership and provides a moral analysis of reasons leaders give for breaking the rules. Dr. Price is also author of Understanding Ethical Failures in Leadership from Cambridge University Press. And one more connection to Great Britain. In 2005, Dr. Price launched the Jepson at Cambridge program that leads students to Cambridge University's Emmanuel College each summer, where they study leadership and the law. Seated to his right is Sir Mark Worthington, who many of you know already. Sir Mark Worthington was appointed as political secretary, followed by private secretary to Lady Thatcher beginning in 1992. And he continued in that capacity for the next 21 years until her death in 2013. He was also director of the Margaret Thatcher Foundation from 1992 to 2010. He's an advisor to the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at Heritage Foundation in Washington, and an advisor to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. Sir Mark is now an independent business consultant specializing in government, public affairs, and international advice. Would you welcome Dr. Price and Sir Mark Worthington.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Sir Mark, for joining us. I'm going to start with a general question. Can you tell us a bit about what the transition was like for Lady Thatcher, moving from being a major political leader to a political figure?
Well, I think it was very difficult time for her. Remember, she'd not been expecting to be leaving Downing Street. It is perhaps an irony that at the very moment that the assassination plot was unplaying, that she was in Paris, perhaps at one might say the zenith of her career, where the conference in Paris was rubber stamping the end of the Cold War and the freeing up of millions and millions of people who've been under communist oppression in Eastern Europe. And it's at this very moment that the assassination of Margaret Thatcher takes place. She was never defeated in an election. She actually polled in her own leadership election, she polled more votes than John Major did when he was subsequently elected leader of the Conservative Party. So she had no time to prepare for what was going to happen. And therefore her ejection from Downing Street was both sudden and brutal. And that took enormous amounts of time to readjust to. I think you have to remember that if you'd have wanted to do a scientific assembly of someone that you would make the perfect prime minister, you would probably have assembled Margaret Thatcher, because everything about her moved towards this pinnacle of premiership. She was the most incredible hard worker. Her work ethic was fantastic. And all of a sudden, here was this person who all her life had worked, was used to taking decisions, and there was nothing to do at all. There was a complete vacuum. She had no work to do, she had no decisions to take, so it was a very difficult time for her in those months following leaving Downing Street, to try to reinvent herself and create a new role for herself.
But she did find things to do, right? And I want to ask you about her role in British politics, maybe in the first decade, and specifically about domestically, maybe some more on Europe, and something about Western values. But let's maybe start with domestically, including her role with successors like Tony Blair.
Well, I mean, I think she was, in leaving office, what she was determined to do was to, people would today say, secure her legacy. Mrs. Thatcher didn't really ever think in terms of her legacy. She almost never looked back. She always looked forward. She was never interested in what had happened. She was always looking to what was going to happen next. But she was determined in the decade after leaving office to secure all the gains that had been made during the 1980s. And in that sense, it, of course, naturally led to some disagreements with her successors. But I think the most important thing is that throughout that whole period, and indeed up to today, all of the fundamentals that she put into place during the 1980s are still there. None of them have been dismantled, whether it be the trade union reforms or anything like that. They're all still in place. And she was determined in those years to keep the politicians to their mettle, to make sure that they didn't waver or, as we heard earlier, wobble. And that is, she set herself that task, to keep the purity of the message, if you like.
Would you like to say more about her views on Europe and...
Well, I mean, as we've heard already from numerous speakers, she had been developing her ideas of Europe. John O'Sullivan said that perhaps probably the Single European Act was the pinnacle of her Europeanism. She had long been sceptical, but in advancing the Single European Act, as we've heard, she thought perhaps we could introduce some Anglo-American economic views into this European corporatism. As it turned out, that failed. And she, by the time of late into her period of prime ministership, she was beginning to see that Europe couldn't be reformed in the way that she would hope. And indeed, the Bruges speech foreshadowed everything that was to come. And so, I mean, during the 90s, right at the beginning of the 90s, she saw the folly of the whole European economic setup. The idea that you could create a European currency where you had such incredibly diverse economies. You had the Mediterranean economies, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and then you had the northern powerhouse economies. And she from the very beginning, did believe that it wasn't possible to forge all these different economies and different peoples together in a currency unit. And she objected to this most strongly. She also, as we've heard, objected to Maastricht, the Maastricht Treaty, which she openly declared she would never have signed. And she saw it as an advancement, a movement in a different way. It created a citizenry of Europe. It created the Union. And she always believed that language was very important. She always took language seriously. She read what people put on paper. Too many politicians, I think, are quite dismissive of what language they use, thinking that they can say one thing today and say something else tomorrow. Mrs. Thatcher was never like that. So she could see the way that some, particularly at the European bureaucracy level, wanted to move the European project Therefore she did come to clash with John Major, her successor, on issues of Europe, but also other issues as well. She thought that John was moving away from the economic and reformist direction that she and her government had established in the 80s. And that somehow, of course, John Major had been chosen because people thought he was the exact opposite of Mrs. Thatcher. They thought they were going to get a period of calm. They were rather, many of her colleagues, alas, were rather found all the activity, as Robin Harris put it yesterday, the electric storm that Mrs. Thatcher was. Many of her colleagues just couldn't keep up to the pace anymore, and therefore they wanted a quiet life, they wanted an easy life, and John Major appeared to offer that. Little were they to know that, of course, in the end, his government was to fall into such complete turmoil that actually they got almost the opposite of that.
I want to ask you about her defense of Western values and maybe optimism or caution about the promotion of Western values, New World Order, those kinds of things.
Well, she was a great. She was a great believer in Western values, and she was quite alarmed in the early 90s that there seemed to be a sort of revisionism going on about the Cold War. People regarded it as not really a war at all. She and Ronald Reagan had always been very clear on their view of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a morally bankrupt system. The Western system was morally right. And therefore this was, they both believed that you had to fight for it. It wasn't just two systems gently competing against one another. One offered freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of action. The other offered complete oppression with hundreds of thousands of people thrown into imprisonment camps, with the gulags, and millions of people oppressed under the communist system. So for Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, their passion for the West was very clear, and she distinctly saw it, that we had won the Cold War. It hadn't been a sort of gentleman's agreement to come to an end. She believed passionately we had won. And in that immediate post-Cold War period, in the international circuit, there were an awful lot of conferences where George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev would go around being incredibly self-congratulatory about one another. Mrs. Thatcher was never prepared to go along with this. It might have been a very amusing show, but she didn't believe that it was true, and she often would attend these conferences, but make quite clear that the one man who was most responsible for the downfall of the Soviet Union and the freeing of Eastern and Central Europe was Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan had stuck to his principles, and she had done the same. And this entire view that somehow Mr. Gorbachev had brought reform, yes, but he had never accepted that Soviet communism was wrong. He wanted to reform Soviet communism. He did not wish to end Soviet communism. And she saw it, that it was because of the pressure that we had brought in the 80s, the rearmament that had exposed the bankruptcy of the Soviet system, that we had brought the Soviet Union first to the negotiating table and finally to its knees. And she was a great proclaimer of that. And today, even today, I think there are lots of people, unfortunately, who want to make apologies for these things. Rather like there were that during the 1930s, there were so many Western fellow travelers who thought that Stalin was a good man and the Soviet Union was the future. Post the Cold War, too many people have fallen into the trap of thinking that, well, actually, wasn't it all nice that it came to an end the way it did? I think if you were living in Soviet Russia or in Eastern Europe, you perhaps wouldn't have taken the same view of that. It wasn't a nice system.
Are there particular events in the 90s in which she exercised influence, intervened, that come to mind? Maybe Pinochet, Bosnia?
Well, I mean, there are a number of causes she took up. But Bosnia, she was one of the first, and indeed one of the only, Western leaders, although not a leader as such anymore, who saw the problem and saw the tragedy of what was happening in the Balkans. She saw it in terms, in a way, it's been said this morning, her view of Europe, her views were shaped very much in the late 1930s, early 1940s. So she saw appeasement as being a bad thing. She saw that weakness in the face of the enemy, weakness in the face of horror, and what was happening in the Balkans was truly horrific. And she saw all of this and couldn't understand how in Europe, other European powers could allow this to happen. And therefore she was hugely sympathetic and supportive of the breakaway nations of the former Yugoslavia. Self-determination in those circumstances she was greatly supportive of, and the aggression of the Serbs she saw, as I say, in some parallel terms to what had happened in the late 1930s. So she was determined to speak out. Of course, she was, as the political elites gathered around, she was denounced roundly. Her own, the British Defence Secretary, Malcolm Rifkind, when she spoke out about the murders in Vukovar, I think it was, denounced her views as saying that she was talking emotional nonsense. None of the establishment would listen to her. The British Prime Minister wouldn't listen to her. Almost no other current politician at that time in either Europe or globally was interested in the case of the Balkans. But she made unusual alliances, with others some from the left of politics. A great ally in America on this was Bob Dole, who she met quite a number of times over this period, and was convinced, and she convinced him that what was happening in Yugoslavia and the potential destabilization of the whole of Europe was incredibly dangerous. And finally, of course, partly because of her voice, President Clinton saw the light and brought pressure where it was necessary to get the Serbs to the negotiating table. So I think she was enormously important. And later, she never visited Sarajevo. She would have liked to have visited Sarajevo, but the situation was always somewhat too dangerous, and she always said She would never want to risk anybody else's life in protecting hers by going to Sarajevo. But she did visit, and Robin was with her when she visited Croatia, and she was greatly honoured and admired in Croatia. And actually only recently, Robin received an award on behalf of the late Mrs. Thatcher, as she now is, in gratitude from the Croatian people for her role in the whole Balkan conflict. It was a tragedy that should never have happened. The breakup of the of the Yugoslav Union was quite right, but the violent aftermath of it is something that Europe, and particularly the European Union, should be deeply ashamed of.
Did the assassination attempt change her view of her own security over time?
It never appeared to. I'm sure it did. I don't think you can be. You can go through someone trying to kill you without it changing you in some way. It never appeared to change her. She was always determined to do what she thought was right. We had lived with IRA terrorism for some considerable time. Therefore, a terrorist atrocity was not new. The attempted assassination of a prime minister, of course, was. But she just became more determined that what she was doing was right. And of course, it curtailed her life very, very considerably, because prior to the Brighton bomb, security around the British Prime Minister was relatively relaxed. It wasn't like you would have round an American president in those days. That all changed after Brighton, and she then lived the rest of her life, as all successive prime ministers do now, in a cocoon of protection. But you adapt. It doesn't have to be a hugely dramatic change. You merely adapt to life in those circumstances, and that's what she did in a very practical way.
You've mentioned character and personal ethic and work ethic, and also a little bit about the source. But can you say more about her character over time, the foundations for that character?
Well, I think, as Robin Harris says in his book, if I may sort of steal the line, that perhaps more than any other British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher was made what she was by her upbringing. And one might say, oh, well, of course, that must be true of everybody. But I think Robin is certainly right that she, more than anybody, emerges from 1930s small town Middle England. She herself said that by the time she went up to Oxford, that almost all her fundamental views were fully formed. And if you look at what is remarkable, if you look at her speech, her first recorded speeches and writings in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and then you go to the final phases of her career and her life, you see this quite remarkable consistency of both thought and passion about the sort of ideas that she pursued all the way along. She never really changed any of the fundamentals. I mean, there are politicians who change their minds quite often. Winston Churchill but notably changed his mind on quite a lot of times. Indeed, he changed parties twice during his career, which was a bit of a remarkable volte-face. But Mrs. Thatcher was just amazingly consistent, and that all comes from life in Grantham, life above the shop, the life of home, life of the chapel. And as was discussed again over this conference, she was a great traditionalist in one sense, but she was also a nonconformist radical. The imprint of Methodism, I think, was very important on her. And she used to say, one of her little sayings was that you preserve the best but change the rest. And that was her view. She didn't just accept things as they were and go along with things as they were. She had a radical eye for change and a determination to make sure that it would change for the better, which of course she pursued all her career.
What effect do you think her character had on her relationship with others, especially other leaders and maybe people such as Reagan?
Well, she and Ronald Reagan hit it off straight away when they first met each other. They were, of course, soulmates in their views of the Soviet Union and their view of the world in general. And both of them, I think, probably flirted with one another very considerably. I think Reagan spent a lot of time being incredibly flattering to Mrs. Thatcher. And the one thing about Mrs. Thatcher, she knew how to flirt when she needed to. She was very good at using her womanly wiles to best effect. So their relationship was a real friendship. I mean, a genuine friendship. Of course, with others, it was less so. Mrs. Thatcher was an impossible woman, I have to tell you. But of course, it was her impossibilities that made her so great. She would not accept this sort of easygoing way that most politicians and world leaders approach things from. She was difficult. She pushed this incredible pace and incredible determination. Lots of people didn't like that. Therefore, those world leaders who just wanted an easy time of it found her very difficult. Others, she obviously built up some interesting relationships. I think Niall was talking earlier about her friendship with Francois Mitterrand, President Mitterrand of France. Of course, another great flirt. One has to say, of course, never with Mrs. Mitterrand. And of course, he famously said, I was looking at the poster earlier, he famously said, of course, of Mrs. Thatcher that she had the eyes of Caligula and the lips of Marilyn Monroe. But they struck up a great friendship, although coming from two very different political backgrounds. And of course, she famously, the person who spotted Mikhail Gorbachev and invited him to Chequers before he was leader. He was in the Politburo. And discovered that in the course of things, she could hold a conversation with him. Previously, in dealing with Soviet leaders, and most communist leaders around the world, you would have a meeting where they would read out basically a statement of how wonderful communism was and all its achievements, etc., etc. And that had been the relationship of all Western leaders with their Soviet counterparts. She found with Gorbachev somebody very different. He started doing that at the beginning of the meeting, but by the end of the meeting he was in argumentative mode. So there was an exchange. For the first time, you were having an exchange rather than two opinions. And so she saw that this was a different man. It was very different from Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernyenko, who had preceded him, and all, of course, who had really come up through the Stalinist system. Gorbachev was really the first post-Stalinist leader, and she got on the telephone immediately afterwards and said to Ronald Reagan, "You must talk to this man. You must meet him. He's a very different type of leader. Obviously much younger. She was used to dealing with. Brezhnev was mostly on a life support machine by the time she became prime minister. She went to President Brezhnev's funeral just a few years after she'd become prime minister, and it was in winter, and her advisors were very worried about how cold it was going to be while they all had to stand there while all the ceremonies went on, and they persuaded her to buy a pair of fur-lined boots. They were quite expensive. Mrs. Thatcher wasn't very pleased about this. She wasn't very pleased about spending lots of money. A very prudent woman. But she was persuaded to buy this pair of fur-lined boots for the funeral. 3 Soviet leader funerals later, she said that probably that investment in the pair of boots was one of the best expenditures she ever had.
So she obviously had a good sense of people, a good sense of other leaders. I can't help but ask you what you think she might make of the current U.S. president.
I think she'd be, in one way I think she'd be very impressed. I think she'd be impressed in the way that, because she was an outsider. She was never ever part of the establishment. As has been said before, she was an outsider even within her own government. So she always recognized the need to shake up the ordinary politics of things. And indeed, that was part of her great appeal back in 1979. She was not prepared to go along with that post-war consensus that had seen the British economy, nation decline. She always said, indeed, that her view was consensus was the negation of politics. So I think she'd look at Mr. Trump and see somebody an outsider shaking the system. And she would also recognize that an awful lot of Americans, whether they be actually Republicans or whether they be Democrats, because if you look at Bernie Sanders' popularity, an awful lot of Americans feel incredibly disillusioned with the way that government has been conducted over the years. And therefore, Donald Trump is a product of that disillusionment. What happens when politicians disconnect from people on specific policies? Heaven knows what she'd think about some of them. But as I say, I think she would believe that you've got to shake the tree from time to time, and therefore, an outsider coming in and challenging all the preconceptions about the way America should be run would actually be no bad thing.
I'll ask you one more question about character and work ethic, and you mentioned pace and determination. I'm sure you saw up close. So what was it like day to day what was her day to day like, and how did it play out in the way she wrote, the time she spent writing, working when she was
Well, of course, famously, she was a workaholic. When she was Prime Minister, she would be up till 1, 2 in the morning working on her red boxes. She'd be down in the study at number 10, probably shortly after 7:30 in the morning. She did have the most phenomenal both work ethic and work practicality. Of course, it had been drummed into her from an early age that work is what mattered. If you weren't working, you weren't actually contributing anything. As a child, I don't think fun would be a word that you would use about the Roberts household when she was growing up. There was nothing like that. It was a determination that you should use your time given by God, that she believed that you should use your time constructively, and therefore she was a phenomenal worker, and several prime ministers post her tried to emulate that, non-successfully, and indeed several of them almost disastrously, because you just cannot compete with that sort of work ethic. But it was because of that she could stay on top of everything. She probably knew, when she was Prime Minister, she probably knew more about government than any other Prime Minister before or since, because she read all the papers that were coming in from around government. And she often knew more about the departments than the departments themselves did. Later in life, having left number 10, obviously the work shrank. There just weren't those sort of decisions to take anymore. But she was, she always, in many ways, she was a great perfectionist. So working for her, she would never let anything go. She'd never, if you write something, write a sentence for her, she would never just accept it. She had to be convinced of it. And working with Mrs. Thatcher was like being in the middle of the Somme battlefield at times. You would be facing this most extraordinary bombardment. But what she was doing, and what those who knew her well knew what she was doing, she had to test every point. She just wouldn't accept a fact unless she had proven it. And that, I think, partly that's the scientist in her. She looked at it almost as a scientist, and that you had to establish these empirical facts in order to prove your case. And as John said in his remarks earlier, one of the things, when people used to say to her, I'm sorry to repeat it, John, people used to say to her, aren't you proud, Mrs. Thatcher, to be the first woman Prime Minister? And she would retort that I'm even more proud to be the first scientist who is a Prime Minister of our country. So that scientific background in her was again very, very important in terms of proving things. Of course, she also loved to argue. There is nothing more that she enjoyed than having the most awful argument with somebody. They were anybody who had probably walked into a room where Mrs. Thatcher was in full flow would have turned around very quickly and slammed the door behind them, thinking, what have I walked into? But argument was, with her, it was constructive rather than destructive. She loved the whole process of arguing, of proving a point, of establishing a point. And she wanted you to argue with her. She admired the people who would argue with her. And often, some of her colleagues, when she was Prime Minister, I don't think quite understood the level she enjoyed the battle. And the moment she thought you were weak, if she thought she could walk over you, you were finished, because she would. And she would do so, and she was quite capable of being very brutal in the way that she would then walk over you, because mentally she had dismissed you. She knew you weren't up to it, you weren't strong enough, and therefore you had in effect been wiped from her mind. But those who stood up to her, those who argued with her, many of them remained her closest friends, and she didn't. No matter how ferocious the exchange could be, she didn't bear grudges. And therefore you could have a really awful argument, which could end up with lots of slamming doors and lots of walking out and lots of other things, but afterwards it would all be forgotten, because she wouldn't think that it was personal. She didn't take things personally. It was just part of this absolutely ferocious way she had of reaching her ideas. I mean, I was saying to someone yesterday that when Robin and I were working with her, often we try to get a point across, and of course, going from A to Z, Robin and I would go from A to Z by going A, B, C, D, E, the logical progression of thought process. At the end of it, we would probably walk out the room knowing that Mrs. Thatcher had started off at A, knowing she had finished at Z, but having no idea whatsoever how she got there, because the thought process would be so completely, it was only Mrs. Thatcher could think like that. But she would end up in the same position. But it was this, I say, this constructive fury that she had that was often off-putting if you weren't up to it, and some people weren't. They resented it and they turned against her, couldn't bear the way she worked. But if you could tolerate it, you could see what she was, understand what she was doing. Every now and again, you had to be brought down a peg or two, I think. But it was the weaker ones, the tireder ones, who often fell by the wayside.
What would it be helpful for us to understand about her last decade?
Well, I mean, her last decades, I think, I'd say the first 10 or 12 years, she was still a remarkable political force. She travelled enormously, and in particular, earlier the speakers were talking about the way she was regarded in Asia. She had phenomenal influence over many Asian leaders. She travelled to South America, where, of course, at the time, in the 90s, they were advancing massive privatization programs based upon the way privatization had been conducted in Britain. So she was incredibly influential there. I think most of all she was influential in Eastern Europe. The visits to Eastern Europe were often incredibly moving. She was seen as this great icon. The first, even in a sense before President Reagan, the Eastern Europeans saw her as someone who was much closer, being a European leader who was talking about freedom and talking about the plight of the Poles and the Czechs and the Hungarians, etc., even before President Reagan did. So they saw her as this woman who had had this great courage to come to their countries under communism and take on in debate the communist leaders. And therefore, whenever we went to those countries, we would have enormous crowds of people would gather to just to see her. They thought she was the most phenomenal person, and they you know, the huge emotion. I remember once we were in went to a Sunday service in a church in Warsaw, and normally the church had about 150, 200 people taking the Sunday service. But the news had got out that Mrs. Thatcher was going. And the church, to say standing room only, I mean, they could not have got a single other person in the church. And there were thousands and thousands of people in the street outside. So she had that connection to them. And those were very, very moving visits. I'd say Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and of course many of them people that she admired. People like President Klaus emerged as leader of the Czech Republic. Were very much. She was somewhat of a mentor to these people. They didn't always do what she wanted them to do. Because, in the 1990s, she spent most of her time travelling around Europe, telling all the Central and Eastern European leaders that whatever they did, they mustn't join the European Union. And all of them, unfortunately, all of them did join the European Union. So they didn't always take her advice. But she did build up these strong rapports with many of them. And I say the admiration I think people had for her was quite extraordinary.
In the United Kingdom, what changes did you see in the way she was perceived as time progressed, and changes in the way maybe she's remembered?
I think she was always perceived, for good or ill, as a phenomenon. During election campaigns, post her leaving office, again, rather like in Eastern Europe, but not with the same perhaps emotion, you would have enormous crowds when Mrs. Thatcher was electioneering. Whole streets would be blocked by people who just wanted to see Margaret Thatcher, who happened to be campaigning in their town. And I have to say, Mrs. Thatcher was a very good campaigner. She loved election campaigns. She particularly loved. She loved to go into supermarkets during election campaigns, and she was followed by the press and media pack. She would head down the aisles with her basket. She always got a basket, and she would be throwing food into her basket. And admittedly, she was always very careful. She would always pick something up and say, "Is this English butter? Is this English bacon?" And then when she came across something that perhaps wasn't English, she would carefully go, "Oh no, I don't think Dennis will like that," and put it back on the shelf again. So she loved campaigning. I remember on one occasion we were campaigning. We were persuaded, I don't know why, to go into a gym. Mrs. Thatcher is not you wouldn't immediately place Mrs. Thatcher and a gym in the same sentence, but part of the campaign was to go into a gym, and of course, she quite liked this, I have to tell you, because there were of course all these young men in their sort of sweatshirts and shorts on all the machines, and lots of testosterone in the air. So she thought that she was flirting, doing her usual flirty self. But there was one lady in her what must have been her late 20s, rather large lady, I'm afraid, and she was on a rowing machine. And as with all these things, they probably weren't doing anything until Mrs. Thatcher turned the corner. But then they start to row or cycle or whatever furiously. And so this lady is pulling at the oars of the rowing machine. And Mrs. Thatcher goes up and says, "That's very impressive, dear. And so I'm very, very impressed by your work." And the woman said, "Yes. Well, if I do so many hundred of these." On the pulls on the oar, I lose about £2. And Lady Thatcher said, "Oh, that's very good, dear, but obviously you've got a long way to go." So she wasn't always the most tactful person either.
If you're allowed, I'm going to ask a couple of questions about you, and then turn things over to the audience, and they can ask their questions. Was there a normal day for you? Like, what was a normal day like?
There was never a normal day with Mrs. Thatcher. No, I don't think anyone who worked with her or for her would ever say they had a normal day, and no 2 days were the same. It would depend what she was doing. Her timetable was, even in post-Downing Street retirement, was incredibly busy. She still saw a lot of world leaders who came through London. She would be always working on speeches, probably much to Robin's horror. The number of speech drafts he had to go through over the years would be, I don't know what if we had to line up all the speeches in a row, how far it would go, I'm not quite sure. She was difficult with speech writing, because she would start off, she'd be given a draft of something, and she'd declare that the draft was marvellous to begin with. And then, after about half an hour, she would start to pick it apart. And you would get, and she always did the same thing. She would always say, "No, the structure's wrong. It's the structure. No, the structure's wrong." She would then get on her hands and knees. She would take her shoes off. So there she was padding around in her stocking feet. She'd then get on her hands and knees, and she'd start to lay out all the pages of the speech on the floor. And she'd start to swap pages. Well, you can imagine, I'm afraid, what confusion this would cause, because you would end up with a page from one section in a page, you might end up a page about China in the section about Russia, and a page about Europe in the section of economics by the time she'd finished. And you just have to walk away from her and leave her to work out her angst on the speech. And then, of course, Robin, who was her main speechwriter, would eventually be called back in, probably gather up all the bits of paper, take them back to his office. He probably changed about one sentence of the whole speech and gave it back to her. And she would then read it and declare, "Oh, that's so much better. You got it right now. It improved so much." So you never had a normal day with Margaret Thatcher. It was always a roller coaster. But as long as you could, it was rather like, I suppose, riding a bucking bronco. As long as you could stay on the horse, you were all right. And you know, that's why so many people came to appreciate her, I think, because she was such an astonishing personality. Someone said earlier about her personal kindness. She would have the most ferocious row with senior, I think it was a gentleman in the audience, was talking about a ferocious row with a senior person. And then I think he mentioned how she'd knock on the window to the chauffeur. I think, was it you, sir? I think you were telling the story. Knock on the window to the chauffeur and say, well, how's your daughter? She was like that. She only ever argued with people who she thought should be able to stand up for themselves. If she thought you couldn't because of your position, if she thought you couldn't stand up for yourself, she was kindness itself. And so often she was fascinated, and I think this was what made her a great success. She was fascinated with what ordinary people did. She didn't just talk to ordinary, she actually listened to what people told her. And she would very often say, at a luncheon party or whatever, or dinner party, at the end of the meal, the host would come up and say, Mark, Mrs. Thatcher's gone. She's, and I'd say, oh, don't worry. And they'd be getting into a panic. Where could she have gone? And I said, oh, well, you don't need to worry, because I can see her protection officers are sitting over there, and they have orders from me to shoot to kill if she tries to get out. So we're quite safe. I said, but if you want to put your mind at rest, if I were you, I'd go to your kitchen. And true enough, they would wander down to the kitchen, and they would find Mrs. Thatcher talking to the cooks and the waiting staff, swapping recipes. I have to say, I would never have taken a recipe off Mrs. Thatcher, because she was not a very good cook. But swapping recipes and just talking to people. I remember we were at when Bob and Maria Tuttle were at the US Embassy in London. We went every year to their Christmas party, and we were just about to leave, and I was talking to Bob and Maria, and we both turned around. We all turned around, and of course Mrs. Thatcher had gone. And we knew she couldn't have gone out the front door, but I said, where's she gone now? And she had wandered along this corridor to go to the coat check-in desk. She didn't have a coat of her own, so there's no reason. But she'd gone to talk to the staff who were manning the cloakroom that evening, and was talking about, she wanted to know about their children and sort of where they lived and all that sort of thing. And she was hugely engaged with people in that way. And I think that's what made her the phenomenal success she was, because many people understood that she was interested in their worries, interested in their concerns, interested in their aspirations and ambitions. And she managed a sort of direct connection in that sense to people. That perhaps in politics it's all too easy to go through the motions of talking to somebody, but not actually listening. Whereas Mrs. Thatcher talked to people and listened to them. And she developed this technique. She'd often say, if she was out campaigning, she'd stop someone and say, oh, can I say before I say anything else, dear, what a lovely colour, that suits you enormously. And immediately you build up a rapport with that person. Or to go up to someone and say, oh, it's very cold, that scarf, I would definitely tuck that scarf in a little bit more. And immediately the ice was broken. You weren't talking to the Prime Minister, you were talking to what people saw as a very ordinary woman. And I think that is part of it. She was, in many ways, a very ordinary woman. But that ordinariness made her the most extraordinary leader, I think.
Do you have a most memorable moment?
A most memorable moment? Well, I think the moment I probably most remember, funnily enough, it was my very first meeting with her when I was going to work for her. I'd been interviewed by her advisors a couple of times for the job. And unbeknown to me, I was suddenly whisked into her office, and these great double doors opened, and I was almost pushed through the door. And then you suddenly heard the door slam behind you, and you thought, this is a bit awkward. And there she was, and she leapt up, and she said, she came across and said, I understand you're going to come to work for me, and that you're brilliant. And I thought, well, both of these are news points to me. And she then said to me, she said, I'm off to Japan in 2 days' time. What should I tell the people of Japan? Now, I froze for what seemed to me half an hour. It was probably only about 4 seconds. I knew absolutely nothing about Japan at all, and very, very little about the Far East, and was struggling to think, what am I going to tell Margaret Thatcher, what she should tell the people of Japan. But I have to say, I didn't need to worry, because she then proceeded almost immediately to tell me what she was going to tell the people of Japan, and she continued to tell me that for the next 40 minutes, at the end of which she again leapt up. The meeting was obviously at an end, and she said, oh, I'm immensely, your thoughts have been so important. I've really now got worked out what I am going to say to them when I go, and I will see you again in 2 weeks. I was out the door.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I've asked enough questions. It's time for you to ask a question.
What was her relationship with Queen Elizabeth? Did she look forward to those weekly meetings, or what was their relationship like?
Their relationship was, I think, much better than if you read some comments about the relationship. It was much better than you would think. Did she look forward to them? No. Mrs. Thatcher was, she was a product of what she was, as I said earlier, small town, Middle England, 1930s. She had an enormous reverence for the Queen, and indeed for all the royal family. She held them in the highest esteem, both as an institution and as people. And therefore, she did not find audiences with the Queen comfortable, partly because Mrs. Thatcher didn't have any chit-chat. And she was so overawed by the Queen that I think that they were probably, I mean, not unfriendly or difficult, but just awkward. I have to say, that is an assumption, because I don't know. Because the one thing about Mrs. Thatcher, in the 21 years I worked for her, I never once heard her say anything about any audience she had with the Queen. She regarded that relationship as between Prime Minister and monarch as absolutely sacrosanct, and she never ever said anything. But I mean, the general comments she always made about the Queen were hugely respectful and hugely admiring.
Lady Thatcher was just beloved and adored in America. She was not beloved and adored in her own England, at least after she left office. Did she ever talk about that? What would be, what was her reaction?
Well, it's in many ways, she just didn't look back. I mean, obviously initially it was very, very difficult. As I said at the very beginning of the conversation, one has to remember that the way she left office was extremely painful. She wasn't ejected by the electorate. She wasn't even ejected by her own parliamentary colleagues, let alone the party. She was assassinated by her own cabinet, those closest to her. So that was very painful to her. But because she wasn't a someone who dwelt over regrets, over what could have been, what might have been type view. She always looked forward to tomorrow, what she wanted to say in the future, what she wanted to do in the future. She overcame it. After a while, she overcame it, and she became. I mean, there's no question. The public reaction to her was remarkable. You had, of course, many on the left who had sort of been through the trade union reforms and hated the liners' strike and hated them. But those people were unreconcilable with her, in any case, with her view. But so many times in going around with her, you would often come across people who would come up to her and say, Mrs. Thatcher, I have to say, I never voted for you, and I did not like many of the policies that you espoused during your time in office. But my God, I admire you, and I wish you were Prime Minister again today. And that was often a reaction from people who didn't share her view of the world, but could see in her the qualities of leadership that Britain so desperately needed in the 1980s. Because many of these people had lived through the absolute despair of the 1970s. And she had come in and, after great struggle, had managed to transform both the economy of Britain, but Britain's sense of itself, sense of its own worth in the world.
I was just curious. I know the actual privatizations took place before you were working very closely with Lady Thatcher, but I was curious, when she was invited to meet with other governments going through privatizations afterwards, did she have any key lessons from her own experience in Britain?
The key to the privatizations was what she wanted to do, and she was only partly successful in this, but not insignificant. But she saw it as part of her task to make every man a capitalist. She saw the importance of privatization was to give all the workers within the industry a preferential stake, so that you could buy the shares if you worked in the gas industry or the electricity industry or whatever. You could buy at a preferential rate than before it went to the general public. And therefore, the workers, for the first time, had a stake in the business they were working in. So that was hugely important to her. The other thing was pricing. I mean, she was determined that, particularly in the initial sales, that it should be priced at a level that ordinary people could afford to buy. Now, they might only buy 10 or 20 or 100 shares, but it was meant intended to largely diversify. Now, over the years, that hasn't worked out the way, because shares have tended to concentrate. But certainly initially, of course, the privatizations were phenomenally successful. And it totally changed people's attitude, if you like, to capitalism. Because before, most people in the country had no involvement in buying shares and selling shares and whatever. For the first time, masses of people had an interest, whether they be the workers or whether they be ordinary people who just wanted to put their money, a few £100 into something, and feel that they got a part of British business. So that was very important to them.
Mark, thank you for these wonderful reflections, and thank you for your service. It's very, very gentle and mild. Reflect, if you would, on the great lady's views with respect to Asia, your charming story about Japan, and I'm so glad you were so helpful to her in framing her thoughts about Japan before she embarked 2 days later. But especially China, the future as she was seeing it unfold, and very remarkable things were indeed unfolding in China during her tenure, but certainly then after her great service as Prime Minister. And then Hong Kong.
The one thing about China, she admired the Chinese people enormously. So in traveling to the Far East, wherever she came, whether it be Singapore or China itself, or certainly in Hong Kong, she always thought that there was something about the Chinese people. They were inherently good at making money. They were natural traders and businessmen. And therefore she had a great admiration for the Chinese. Her relations with the Chinese government were often difficult. I think partly because she was, as been said before, she was not prepared to say one thing in private and another thing in public. She was consistent. She would raise very difficult issues with the Chinese government, and she would receive very difficult responses from them, often quite acrimonious meetings. But because of the honest exchange from both sides, I think there did come to be a growing sense of admiration. She saw that Deng Xiaoping wanted to move China in a very different way. She didn't think it was necessarily completely the right way, because of course the Chinese didn't think that they were going to, and still haven't allowed, westernized democracy. But Deng Xiaoping did realize that what he wanted to do was open up the economy and therefore generate a dynamic economic China, something that we can see is happening today. And so she did build up this respect for them and from them. Hong Kong was always difficult for her. We were talking earlier about colonialism and post-colonialism, and how all that fits with some freedom. And obviously Hong Kong was a very difficult issue for Mrs. Thatcher. Here was a colonial anomaly. The situation, as you probably know, was that Hong Kong Island had been ceded to Britain in perpetuity, but that we had leased the new territories just across the water. And simply Hong Kong could not have survived without the new territories. They relied on the new territories, and it was the new territories that were to return to China. Her own instincts, and when she started the negotiation, was that she wanted to come to an accommodation where British rule would continue. The Chinese, Deng Xiaoping made that very clear right at the start, that wasn't going to happen. Therefore, she was trying to get the best deal possible for the people of Hong Kong and trying to protect as much as possible the way of life they enjoy. At the time, I mean, history will judge whether it was the right deal, but I think she felt that China was beginning to change economically, and she was quite confident that once we got 50 years on, that actually she felt that mainland China would almost be like Hong Kong, that you would have achieved because you were achieving all the economic liberties. And she was convinced in her own heart of hearts that once you gave people all those economic liberties, very soon they would want the political liberty to go with it. If you're used to taking your own decisions in business, about spending your own money, etc., sooner or later you're going to say, wait a minute, why can't I have a choice in other areas as well, in politics, and why can't we have a more democratic system? So she thought that eventually that you would get this melding of the two systems, that they would reach the same point. But it was a very difficult decision, and a very painful one. And the handover was a very sad day, I think, for her. But the Chinese respected her greatly. But I think if you remember on the very day of the handover, just as Governor Patton went onto the lawn of the governor's residence, and just as they began to lower the governor's flag, it started to rain. It then proceeded for the next 5 hours as a torrential tropical downpour. And as somebody said, which did not please the superstitious Chinese, that of course these were the tears of the gods, the tears of heaven at the end of British rule. So that didn't necessarily, I say, please the Chinese, who are incredibly suspicious about these things. But what is remarkable is that transition was managed with no violence at all. We now have understandable protests in Hong Kong about some of the ways that the authorities have behaved, but by and large there has been no great political violence there. By and large, most of the guarantees she negotiated are broadly kept to, perhaps not always as we would like to the absolute letter, but broadly kept to. And there is certainly economically a huge amount of freedom still in Hong Kong.
How concerned was Mrs. Thatcher about the future of Scotland and also the future of Northern Ireland? And how did she evaluate Tony Blair's handling of those issues with devolution and the Good Friday Agreement? What were her thoughts on that?
She was a passionate believer in the Union. I don't think it overly crossed her mind about Scottish devolution at all. It wasn't the issue in the 1980s that it was later to become. The problem with Scotland in her day, of course, was the number of Labour seats up there, and the almighty imbalance that you had, that Scotland, in effect, propped up every Labour government because of all the Labour seats up in Scotland. Labour often did not have a majority of seats in England, but they could always rely on all their seats in Scotland. So in terms of nationalism, that sort of thing where we are today was not a great matter. In Northern Ireland, obviously, that was very different, because we had, from the very start, and prior to her, of course, becoming Prime Minister, there was a real problem with IRA violence and the nationalist cause in Ulster. She was naturally sympathetic to the unionist cause, because she herself was a unionist. She believed in the union of the United Kingdom. So she was sympathetic. She didn't always find the unionists easy, the unionist leadership not always easy, but she was a great believer. And someone, I can't remember who he was, I think it was John Bolton earlier, was saying, there are times, no matter who you are as a politician or Prime Minister, when the weight of the bureaucracy is heading in one direction, and you simply get taken along with it. And I think Mrs. Thatcher, though sympathetic, very sympathetic to the unionist cause, ran out of options of what to do with Ulster, and therefore, came to Anglo-Irish agreement. I think she was probably very wary of it, but she saw it as the only way forward because there wasn't any other thinking that gave her options on that. And it then moved on, but she would often, some people say, sort of, when we had the hunger strikers and Bobby Sands, Mrs. Thatcher took absolutely no pleasure in that. She did not want those hunger strikers, no matter how she regarded them as terrorists, she did not want them to die. It wasn't that she didn't want them to die for political reasons. She didn't want them to die for very human reasons. She just thought it was senseless, someone starving themselves to death. And therefore, there were lots of back channels working with, trying to work with the hunger strikers, but certainly trying to work with some of the leadership of the IRA by very, very diverse back channels to see if there were ways and means that you could avoid this. But of course, she wasn't prepared to compromise when it came to terror. I mean, she was quite determined that terror must never succeed, and that the moment you gave in, then you were opening up a whole Pandora's box of problems, and therefore she just felt that for the sake of the people, she had to ultimately stand firm, and I say very determined that terror must never succeed.
So you talked about early on in the interview kind of about Margaret Thatcher's ideas of the West with respect to the Cold War and kind of Western values or whatever. So my question would be, how would you say, and to what extent did her conceptualizations of the West change, and how were they changed by kind of the situation of her premiership within the context of the Cold War? And if she hadn't been presiding over Britain during the Cold War, how do you think that her idea of, what the West was and what Western values were would or would not have changed?
I think that because of, I said, to begin with, you have to go back to her view of appeasement, etc., and the whole of the causes running up to the Second World War, which was very much part of her childhood at a very impressionable age. She was also a great admirer of Churchill's, and therefore Churchill's growing awareness of the Soviet threat. She always carried around with her a copy of Churchill's speech in a handbag at the Fulton, Missouri speech, the Iron Curtain speech. She always had a copy of that with her wherever she went. So she was very influenced by that, and she did come very, but because of what she read and what she was told, the stories that people who had escaped Soviet oppression told her, she saw that you were dealing with an evil as just as equal of that of Nazi Germany, a system that had no moral values, no concern for its citizens, that could operate mass brutality, and ultimately a system that was determined to spread its ways to the West. And after all, from the post-war period, it was the Soviets that were expanding their power in the world, whether it be westwards into takeovers into Central Europe, or whether it be obviously in the 1970s, all the problems are in Africa, Soviet involvement, often through their Cuban protege, all the problems in Africa, and then, of course, all the problems of communism in Central and Southern America started to emerge. So she saw this as a complete challenge to the Western freedom system, and because she viewed it as a moral challenge, that she was absolutely convinced, as was President Reagan, that we were right, our system was right, and that's very much a lot of people. John O'Sullivan was saying, a lot of people resent Mrs. Thatcher almost, because actually she turned out to be right on almost everything. And that is what a lot of people cannot stand, that she actually got it right. And as John was saying, the whole of for instance, the European argument, that she was sneered at, people looked down at her views, they were incredibly dismissive about this simplistic, stupid, absolutely backward idea. But of course, she has proved to be much more in touch with what ordinary people thought. She was, as John said, ahead of the game. She saw things in a clear manner, and she knew ultimately that the British people would come to see it in a clear manner. But she was not put off just because of what anyone said about her. She wouldn't be deflected. One of the things she had learned from her childhood, from what her father had said to her, is, you don't go along with the crowd. You do what is right. And that was an impression made upon her at a very early age and stayed with her right the way through her life and her career, that she tended to do what was right. She didn't just bend. Yes, of course, she could be flexible. She could be pragmatic. But at the core, because she knew it was right, because she knew where she wanted to go, she often spoke about the virtues that she upheld. That's the stars to steer by. She always believed that if she could keep the fixed stars, she could find her course, no matter what politics threw at you and how far you were knocked off course in the general run of politics, and people always are. She knew if she had the stars to steer by, those fixed sets, she could get back to where she wanted to be. And she often quoted a poem by a lady called Ella Wheeler Wilcox, which goes, "One ship sails east and another sails west, by the self-same gales that blow. 'Tis the set of the sail and not the gale which determine the way they go." So you set the sail, no matter what the storms, no matter what the winds are coming in. If you are clear where you want to go, you can set your own course and let politics do its worst.
That's a very nice note to end on.